The work I'm going to present is on the role of consequences, norms, and general inaction in moral dilemmas, and a new model of moral decision-making that we call the C&I model. All of this work was conducted in collaboration with Joel Armstrong, Paul Conway, Rebecca Friesdorf, and Mandy Hütter. When I give this talk to a regular audience, I typically ask people if they know this person, but obviously that doesn't really work with this format. So I will give you the answer right away. His name is Dr. Kent Brantley. Dr. Brantley became widely known in the summer 2014 as the first American citizen who got infected with Ebola in Liberia. It soon became clear that Dr. Brantley would not survive his infection if he wasn't returned to the United States for special treatment. But as many of you might remember, his potential return sparked a heated debate about what is morally right thing to do in this particular case. On the one hand, there were people who argued that we have a moral duty to return him to give him the treatment that he needs to survive. On the other hand, there were people who argued that returning him involves a considerable risk of causing an Ebola outbreak in the United States. So although it may not be a nice thing to do, it would ultimately be better to let him die in Liberia instead of causing the death of many more people. The conflicting views in this debate broadly reflect two moral principles that have dominated academic debates in both moral philosophy as well as moral psychology. From a utilitarian view, the moral status of a given action depends on its consequences. This view resonates with the argument that it might be better to let Dr. Brantley die in Liberia because returning him may ultimately kill a lot more people. In contrast, from a deontological view, the moral status of an action depends on the consistency of that action with moral norms. This view resonates with the argument that there's a moral duty to save Dr. Brantley's life, and not saving him would be a violation of this moral duty. Another distinction that has become very important in psychological research on moral judgment is Wittgenstein's distinction between rule-following and rule-conforming. Conceptually, rule-following judgments can be described as responses that result from the actual application of the relevant rule. In contrast, rule-conforming judgments are responses that are consistent with the relevant rule, but do not involve its application in the production of the response. This distinction is important because it captures a fundamental shift in moral psychology around the millennium. As Green and Haidt argued in a highly influential paper, many moral judgments and decisions may result from psychological processes that do not involve a reasoned application of moral rules and principles. One of the most prominent examples in this regard is Josh Green's dual process theory of moral judgment, which argues that utilitarian judgments are the result of controlled cognitive analysis of costs and benefits, whereas deontological judgments are rooted in automatic effective responses to the idea of causing harm. So the dominant paradigm to test these assumptions has been Philippa Foot's well-known trolley dilemma, in which a runaway trolley approaches a group of 5 people that would be killed unless the trolley is redirected to another track, where it would kill only 1 person. In research using the trolley problem, actions to redirect or stop the trolley are usually interpreted as instances of utilitarian responses, in the sense that they maximize the well-being of a larger number of people. In contrast, the preference for inaction is typically interpreted as a deontological response, in the sense it is consistent with the moral norm that one should kill not other people, regardless of how many lives are saved. Although the trolley problem has become one of the most frequently used paradigms in moral psychology, it also received a lot of criticism. One important criticism of the trolley problem is that many participants find it extremely unrealistic and rather amusing, which makes it unlikely to elicit the same kind of emotional responses that are elicited by moral dilemmas in the real world. Although there is some validity to that argument, it could be easily resolved by using more realistic scenarios with a high degree of real-world relevance. For example, after 9/11, there's been a heated debate about whether it would be morally acceptable to shoot down a hijacked passenger plane to prevent terrorists from crashing it into a densely populated area. The overall structure of this dilemma is conceptually equivalent to the trolley dilemma in that it pits consequences against moral norms. However, it is much more realistic and certainly does not cause any sort of amusement. The argument that I would like to make in this talk is that there's a much more fundamental problem that applies even to such realistic scenarios. I call this problem the identification problem. To illustrate the identification problem, it is helpful to take a step back and consider the core aspects of utilitarianism and deontology. From a utilitarian view, the moral status of a given action depends on its overall consequences. So based on this definition, a utilitarian judgment is a judgment that is sensitive to consequences. In contrast, from a deontological view, the moral status of a given action depends on its consistency with moral norms. So based on this definition, a deontological judgment is a judgment that is sensitive to moral norms. So how can we know that a judgment is sensitive to consequences and norms? From a basic research methods views, the answer is actually very simple. We need to manipulate them. To find out whether judgments are sensitive to consequences, we need to manipulate consequences and investigate whether judgments differ across conditions with different consequences. To find out whether judgments are sensitive to moral norms, we need to manipulate norms and investigate whether judgments differ across conditions with different norms. The problem with most previous moral dilemma studies is that, aside from a few exceptions, consequences and norms are hardly ever manipulated. Let me first consider the utilitarian side and explain why the lack of a manipulation of consequences is a problem. In the trolley problem, the question is whether it is acceptable to redirect the trolley if such an action would save the lives of 5 and kill only 1 person. The typical interpretation is that participants have made a utilitarian judgment when they say that it is acceptable to redirect the trolley in this particular case. But now imagine a case where redirecting the trolley would save only 1 person. If a participant would redirect the trolley in either of these 2 cases, we would not call this person's judgments utilitarian because their observed judgments are not sensitive to consequences. In fact, we may be more inclined to call such a person a psychopath rather than a utilitarian. Consistent with this concern, there have been several studies showing that participants with subclinical levels of psychopathy are more likely to accept harmful actions in a trolley problem compared to non-psychopaths. Does this mean that psychopaths are more concerned about maximizing the well-being for a larger number of people? I guess that seems rather unlikely. Instead, it seems more likely that they're willing to engage in harmful actions regardless of the consequences. To distinguish between the 2 cases, we would have to experimentally manipulate consequences. Otherwise, we'll never know if acceptance to harmful action reflects concern with maximizing consequences or willingness to engage in harmful action regardless of the consequences. A similar argument applies to the identification of deontological judgments, which require manipulation of moral norms. Again, aside from a few exceptions, norms have almost never been manipulated in research on moral dilemma judgments. One important distinction in this context is the distinction between proscriptive and prescriptive norms. Proscriptive norms are those that specify what people should not do. Prescriptive norms are those that specify what people should do. The reason why this distinction is so important is that it has fundamental implications for the identification of deontological responses. If deontological responses are defined as responses that are sensitive to moral norms, a deontological response in cases involving proscriptive norms would be inaction. However, in cases involving prescriptive norms, a deontological response would be action. The relevance of this argument may not be immediately evident from the trolley problem, but it is nicely illustrated by the Ebola dilemma. In the debate about Dr. Brantley's return to the United States, the mapping between action and inaction on the one hand and utilitarianism and deontology on the other hand is actually completely reversed. In this case, the utilitarian principle suggests inaction because inaction prevents potential harm to a greater number of people. In contrast, the deontological principle suggests action, assuming that there is a moral duty to save his life. What this example illustrates is that there's a fundamental difference between sensitivity to moral norms on the one hand and general preference for inaction over action on the other hand. To the extent that a person prefers inaction in cases involving a proscriptive norm and action in cases involving a prescriptive norm, it seems certainly justified to conclude that that person's judgment is sensitive to moral norms. Yet, if a person shows a general preference for inaction regardless of whether the relevant norm is proscriptive or prescriptive, the more appropriate conclusion is that the person showed the omission bias, which describes the finding that harm caused by action is typically perceived as worse compared to the same amount of harm caused by inaction. From a psychological view, sensitivity to norms and general preference for inaction are fundamentally different because they involve different behavioral consequences, as shown in the case of prescriptive norms, and those different consequences have presumably different underlying psychological processes. So together, these conceptual arguments suggest that we need to independently manipulate consequences and norms. We need dilemmas involving either a prescriptive or a proscriptive norm, where the benefits of action are either greater or smaller than the costs of action. The traditional trolley paradigm is limited in the sense that it focuses only on one of those four cases. These are dilemmas in which a proscriptive norm prohibits action and the benefits of action are greater than the costs. The typical interpretation is that action on this type of dilemma represents a utilitarian response and inaction represents a deontological response. My argument is that action on this type of dilemma is necessary but insufficient to categorize a judgment as utilitarian. To qualify as utilitarian, the response pattern across the four types of dilemmas should include an action response in cases where the benefits of action are greater than the costs, and inaction in cases where the benefits of action are smaller than the costs. A similar argument applies to the interpretation of deontological responses. My argument is that inaction on the trolley dilemma or trolley type dilemmas is necessary but insufficient to categorize a judgment as deontological. To qualify as deontological, the response pattern across the four types of dilemmas should include an inaction response in cases where there's a proscriptive norm and an action response in cases where there's a prescriptive norm. This response pattern has to be distinguished from a general preference for inaction regardless of consequences and norms, and similarly, the utilitarian response pattern has to be distinguished from a general preference for action regardless of consequences and norms. So empirically, what needs to be done is this. We need to measure participants' responses across the four types of scenarios and then quantify the extent to which their responses reflect a response pattern that is sensitive to consequences in a utilitarian sense, a response pattern that is sensitive to moral norms in a deontological sense, and a response pattern of general inaction versus action regardless of consequences and norms. To illustrate how we've done this in our own research, here's an example of a scenario involving a proscriptive norm where the benefits of action are either greater or smaller than the costs of action. The critical part of the cost-benefit manipulation is highlighted in red here, and the conceptual counterpart to the trolley dilemma is presented on the left. So I will just briefly read that to you. You're the director of a hospital in a developing country. A foreign student who was volunteering in the country got infected with a rare virus. The virus is highly contagious and deadly to seniors and children. The only medication that can effectively stop the virus from spreading has severe side effects. Although the virus will not kill her, the student suffers from a chronic immune deficiency that will make her die from the side effects. Is it acceptable in this case to give the student the medication? So the scenario on the right is identical to the standard trolley type of dilemma, the only difference being the severity of the virus. In this case, the virus can cause severe stomach cramps, but it doesn't kill anyone. The scenarios for the prescriptive condition are similar, the only difference being that the focal norm is prescriptive rather than proscriptive. In the current example, the critical difference is that the student suffers from a chronic immune deficiency that will make her die from the virus if she's not returned to her home country for special treatment. However, taking her out of quarantine involves a considerable risk that the virus will spread. The question is whether it is acceptable to take the student out of quarantine to take her home to her home country for treatment. In our research, we created 6 basic scenarios and prepared 4 different variants of each scenario, based on a manipulation of consequences and a manipulation of norms. We then gave those 24 dilemmas to our participants and used a mathematical technique called multinomial modeling to quantify the extent to which participants' responses across the 24 dilemmas reflect a pattern that is sensitive to consequences, a pattern that is sensitive to moral norms, and a pattern of general inaction versus action regardless of consequences and norms. Using a statistical procedure called maximum likelihood statistics, multinomial modeling provides 3 parameters to capture the 4 response patterns. One parameter, which we label C parameter, captures the extent to which participants' responses across the dilemmas are sensitive to consequences. Higher scores on this parameter reflect a greater sensitivity to consequences. A second parameter, which we label N parameter, captures the extent to which participants' responses across the dilemmas are sensitive to moral norms. Higher scores in this parameter reflect a greater sensitivity to moral norms. And finally, a third parameter, which we label I parameter, captures the extent to which participants' responses reflect a general preference for inaction versus action, regardless of consequences and norms. Higher scores on this parameter reflect a greater general preference for inaction, and lower scores reflect a greater general preference for action. Based on the letter labels of the three parameters, we called our model the C&I model of the moral decision making. I won't go into the details into how multinomial modeling works, but I just want to mention a few words on the basic idea. Based on the processing tree depicted on this slide, multinomial modeling generates a number of equations with three parameters as unknowns and the observed probabilities of showing an action or inaction response in a given dilemma type as known values. So with four types of moral dilemmas and three parameters, our multinomial model provides four equations with three unknowns. Using maximum likelihood statistics, multinomial modeling then tries to identify a value for each of the three parameters that minimizes the discrepancy between the probabilities observed in the dataset and the probabilities predicted by the model when these values are included in the equations. For example, according to the processing tree, the probability of showing an action response on a dilemma with a proscriptive norm where the benefits of action are greater than the costs is equal to C plus 1 minus C multiplied by 1 minus n multiplied by 1 minus I. Conversely, the probability of showing an inaction response in a dilemma with a proscriptive norm where the benefits of action are greater than the costs is equal to 1 minus C multiplied by n plus 1 minus C multiplied by 1 minus n multiplied by I. How these equations are generated on the basis of the processing tree is explained in detail in the supporting paper that is available for this presentation. So instead of talking about technical details, I will use the remainder of my talk to present some of the findings that we obtained with the C&I model. I will present the results of 8 studies. 2 studies investigated the nature of gender differences in moral judgments. 2 studies investigated the effects of cognitive load. 2 studies investigated the effect of emotional involvement, and 2 studies investigated the relation between psychopathy and moral dilemma judgments. In the first study, we were interested in the nature of gender differences in moral judgments. There are a number of studies showing that men are more likely to accept harmful action in the trolley paradigm than women. From the perspective of our C&I model, this difference may be due to a greater sensitivity to consequences among men, a greater sensitivity to moral norms among women, a stronger general preference for inaction among women, or any combination of those three. To test the nature of gender differences in moral judgment, we asked a sample of 201 participants on Amazon's mTurk to complete our battery of 24 moral dilemmas and then analyze the data in the traditional manner and then with the C&I model. I will first show you the results of the traditional analysis. So what is shown here is the number of action choices on dilemmas that have the same structure as the trolley problem, and that a proscriptive norm prohibits action and the benefits of action are greater than the costs of action. Our results basically replicate the findings of earlier studies in that men were more likely to accept an action response in this particular type of dilemma than women. But the critical question is whether this difference is driven by a greater sensitivity to consequences among men, a greater sensitivity to moral norms among women, or a stronger general preference for inaction among women, or any combination of those three. The results from the C&I model analysis provide an answer to this question. Our findings suggest that women are more sensitive to moral norms than men, which is reflected in a significantly higher score on the N parameter for women compared to men. Moreover, women showed a significantly higher score on the I parameter, suggesting that women have a stronger general preference for inaction than men. There was no significant gender difference on the C parameter. Because of recent concerns about the reproducibility of psychological findings, we conducted a replication study with the same materials in the new sample of 197 participants on mTurk. In this study, we actually failed to replicate the commonly found gender difference in research with a trolley problem. There was no significant difference between men and women in the average number of action choices on dilemmas that have the same structure as a trolley problem. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that men and women didn't differ in our study. Actually, despite the failure to replicate the commonly found gender difference in the traditional analysis, our analysis with the CNI model showed a much more nuanced and much more consistent picture. Replicating the results of our first study, women showed a significantly higher score on the N parameter, suggesting that women were more sensitive to moral norms than men. Women also showed a significantly higher score on the I parameter, suggesting that women have a stronger general preference for inaction than men. In this study, there was also a significant effect on the C parameter, such that women showed a greater sensitivity to consequences than men. What is interesting about this pattern of parameter effects is that it explains why there was no significant effect in the traditional analysis. In the traditional approach, greater sensitivity to consequences influences judgments in a way that is opposite to the effect of greater sensitivity to norms and stronger general preference for inaction. As a result, these effects cancel each other out in the traditional analysis, which falsely suggests that there's no gender difference between men and women. The findings with the CNI model clearly show that this is not the case. In fact, men and women in the current study significantly differed in all three determinants, but these effects could not be detected in the traditional approach because it confounds the three determinants in a single judgment score. In the following study, we were interested in the effect of cognitive load on moral dilemma judgments. Based on Josh Green's dual process theory, a common assumption in the moral dilemma literature is that utilitarian judgments are the result of a deliberate cognitive analysis of costs and benefits. Consistent with this hypothesis, a number of studies have shown that action choices in the trolley dilemma are reduced by manipulations that reduce participants' cognitive capacity. In the current study, we were interested in gaining deeper insights into how cognitive load affects moral judgments. Toward this end, we showed participants either a 2-digit or an 8-digit string before each dilemma, asked them to memorize it, and reported after they read and responded to the dilemma. The condition with the 2-digit string was interpreted as a low-load condition. The condition with the high 8-digit string was interpreted as the high-load condition. When we analyzed our data with a traditional approach, we found a marginal effect, such that participants in the high-load condition were less likely to accept action responses and trolley-type dilemmas compared to participants in the low-load condition. Although the difference was only marginal, the direction of that difference was consistent with the results of earlier studies. However, when we analyzed the data with the CNI model, there was no evidence that cognitive load affected participants' sensitivity to consequences in a utilitarian sense. There was also no significant effect in participants' sensitivity to moral norms. Instead, the only significant effect occurred for the I parameter, such that participants were more action averse under conditions of high load compared to low load. A potential interpretation of this finding is that participants under high load felt that they don't have the cognitive capacity to make a well-informed decision, and therefore preferred not to engage in any action because harm caused by action is typically perceived as worse than the equivalent harm caused by action. That's the phenomenon known as the omission bias. So to ensure that this finding is reliable, we conducted a replication study with the same materials in a new sample of 194 participants. In this study, we again replicated the finding of earlier studies showing that cognitive load reduces the acceptance of action responses in trolley-type dilemmas, and this time the difference was statistically significant. Moreover, when we analyzed the data with the CNI model, we replicated our earlier findings, suggesting that this effect is driven by a stronger general preference for inaction among participants in a high-load condition compared to the low-load condition. There were again no significant effects on participant sensitivity to consequences on the C parameter and their sensitivity to moral norms on the N parameter. So as we discuss in the paper on this work, it is possible to reconcile this finding with Green's dual process theory in a post-hoc fashion, but any such reconciliation would require a number of additional assumptions that are not exactly spelled out in the original theory. In our view, it makes more sense to explain effects of cognitive load in terms of increased action aversion, in the sense of the omission bias, rather than deliberate analyses of costs and benefits, which should have reduced the scores on the C parameter, which clearly was not the case. In a third set of studies, we were interested in the effects of emotional involvement. A central assumption of Green's dual process theory is that deontological judgments are rooted in automatic emotional responses to the idea of causing harm. So to the extent that emotional involvement enhances the strength of such automatic emotional responses, It should increase the likelihood for inaction choices in the traditional dilemma approach. Consistent with this prediction, Green and colleagues found that participants were less likely to show an action response in the trolley problem when the response option was to push an overweight man from a bridge to stop the trolley than when they could redirect the trolley to another track by switching a lever. The basic idea underlying this manipulation was that personal contact with the target of one's action increases emotional involvement, which in turn should enhance automatic negative reactions to the idea of causing harm. In our research, we used a somewhat different manipulation of emotional involvement. Instead of manipulating emotional involvement via physical contact, half of our participants were asked to judge whether the described action is morally acceptable. The other half was asked to indicate whether they would actually perform the described action. The basic idea underlying this manipulation is that abstract questions about moral acceptability are much less emotionally involving than questions about whether one would engage in a particular action. So although the manipulation was different from the one used by Green and colleagues, the underlying psychological construct is assumed to be the same. When we analyzed the data with a traditional approach, we found a mean level difference in the direction consistent with Green's findings, such that participants were less likely to accept action responses on trolley-type dilemmas in the moral action condition compared to the moral judgment condition, but this difference was not statistically significant. More nuanced insights were again provided by our analysis with the CNI model. What you can see here is the participants in the moral action condition showed a stronger general preference for inaction on the I parameter compared to participants in the moral judgment condition. This result suggests that emotional involvement influences moral judgments by increasing action aversion, not by increasing sensitivity to moral norms. In fact, sensitivity to moral norms showed a marginal effect in the opposite direction, in that participants in the moral action condition were less sensitive to moral norms than participants in the moral judgment condition. There was no significant effect on sensitivity to consequences on the C parameter. The marginal effect on sensitivity to norms was somewhat unexpected by us, so we were curious to see if it replicated in a follow-up study with the same materials in the new sample of 189 participants. Similar to findings of our earlier study, participants were less likely to accept action responses on trolley-like dilemmas in the moral action condition compared to the moral judgment condition, but this difference again failed to reach statistical significance. But more importantly, we did replicate our earlier findings with the CNI model, showing that participants in the moral action condition showed a stronger general preference for inaction on the I parameter compared to participants in the moral judgment condition. Moreover, participants in the moral action condition were again less sensitive to moral norms than participants in the moral judgment condition, and this effect was statistically significant in the current study. There was again no significant effect on sensitivity to consequences on the C parameter. These results suggest that emotional involvement influences moral judgments by increasing action aversion and by decreasing sensitivity to moral norms. The finding that emotional involvement increases action aversion can be easily reconciled with Green's dual process theory with a small number of additional assumptions, but the theory is much more difficult to reconcile with a finding that emotional involvement reduces sensitivity to moral norms. In the final set of studies, we were interested in the effects of psychopathy on moral dilemma judgments. As I mentioned earlier in this talk, several studies have found that participants with subclinical levels of psychopathy are more likely to accept action responses in the trolley dilemma compared to non-psychopaths. This finding has been used by some as an argument against the validity of the trolley problem to study moral judgments. In the final set of studies, we're interested in whether the CNI model can provide deeper insight into the difference between psychopaths and non-psychopaths. Toward this end, we initially recruited a sample of approximately 500 men and gave them a standardized measure of psychopathy. Of these participants, we selected the ones with psychopathy scores in the highest and the lowest quartile and invited them to complete our battery of 24 moral dilemmas. Counter to the findings of earlier studies, we actually did not find any significant difference between the two groups when we analyzed the data in the traditional way. There was no significant difference between participants high versus low in psychopathy in their action choices in the traditional trolley-type dilemmas. Does this mean that there were no differences between psychopaths and non-psychopaths? Not at all. Our findings with the CNI model suggest that the two groups differed on all three model parameters. The strongest effect occurred for the N parameter, showing that participants high in psychopathy were less sensitive to moral norms than participants low in psychopathy. There was also a marginal difference on the C parameter, showing that participants high in psychopathy were less sensitive to consequences than participants low in psychopathy. And finally, there was a marginal difference on the I parameter, showing that participants high in psychopathy were less action averse than participants low in psychopathy. Because the effects on the C and the I parameter were only marginal, we were interested in whether these findings actually replicate in a follow-up study with the same materials. In this study, we again recruited a sample of approximately 500 men and gave them a standardized measure of psychopathy. We then again selected the ones with psychopathy scores in the highest and lowest quartile and invited them to complete our battery of 24 moral dilemmas. In this study, we did replicate the finding of earlier studies, showing that participants high in psychopathy were more likely to show action choices and traditional trolley-type dilemmas compared to participants low in psychopathy. But more importantly, we also replicated all the findings with the CNI model. The strongest effect again occurred for the N parameter, showing that participants high in psychopathy were less sensitive to moral norms than participants low in psychopathy. There was also a significant difference on the C parameter, showing that participants high in psychopathy were less sensitive to consequences than participants low in psychopathy. And finally, there was a significant difference on the I parameter, showing that participants high in psychopathy were less action averse than participants low in psychopathy. Although the obtained differences on the C and I parameter were only marginal in our earlier study, both effects were statistically significant in the current one. So together, the two studies demonstrate the usefulness of the CNI model in providing more nuanced insights that cannot be gained with a traditional dilemma approach. So to conclude, the starting point of my talk was that utilitarian responses should be understood as judgments that are sensitive to consequences, and that deontological responses should be understood as judgments that are sensitive to moral norms. If this idea is taken seriously, unambiguous identification of utilitarian and deontological responses requires experimental manipulations of consequences and norms. If that is done, it becomes possible to independently quantify sensitivity to consequences, sensitivity to moral norms, and general preference for inaction versus action regardless of consequences and norms. And that's what we see as the primary contribution of our CNI model. In fact, several of our findings obtained with the CNI model pose a challenge to the dominant dual process account of moral dilemma judgments. Our findings suggest that the behavioral evidence for the dual process model reflects influences on the omission bias rather than sensitivity to consequences in a utilitarian sense or sensitivity to norms in a deontological sense. As a caveat to this conclusion, it is important to note that the omission bias can be interpreted in deontological terms by invoking the principle of doing and allowing. So in that sense, either of the two response patterns may be described as deontological in a philosophical sense. However, any such interpretation would still have to explain why one way of deontological responding can show effects that are opposite to the other way of deontological responding, as we found in our studies on emotional involvement. In response to this concern, one might be tempted to bring up neuroscientific evidence, but I would argue that this evidence doesn't help either. If the behavioral paradigm to obtain neuroscientific data is flawed, the evidence provided by neuroscientific studies will be ambiguous by implication. So based on these considerations, I would draw the bold conclusion that after 16 years of research and hundreds of studies with the trolley paradigm, we still don't know much about the processes underlying moral dilemma judgments. So before I conclude, I also want to raise a few practical implications. One domain in which moral dilemma research can make a valuable contribution to society is by uncovering the psychological reasons for disagreements about contentious moral issues, such as the debate about Dr. Brentley's return to the United States to treat his Ebola infection, or the debate about whether it is acceptable to shoot a hijacked passenger plane to prevent terrorists from crashing it into a densely populated area. I would argue that research with the CNI model could help to resolve such disagreements by identifying the psychological reasons behind them. A common attribution in these debates is that proponents of the conflicting view do not care about morality, and that may not be the case. In fact, these differences may be much more nuanced, and identifying the nature of these differences may be a first helpful step in overcoming them. So before I would conclude, I would like to thank my collaborators Joel Armstrong, Paul Conway, Rebecca Friesdorf, and Mandy Hütte, as well as the National Science Foundation for supporting this research. For those who are interested in reading more about this work, I recommend our recently published article in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And for those who are interested in actually applying the CNI model in their own work, we have prepared a zip file with a tutorial, templates for data analysis, and other relevant materials that can be directly downloaded at my lab website at www.bertramgawronski.com. Thank you so much for your interest in this presentation, and I'm looking forward to your comments.